Caltech, and was working on a PhD when I left to enter the order, PhD in applied physics. And one of the things that's always frustrated me is that very often scientists claim a kind of level of authority that is not justified by their science. Right? I'm a scientist. I've taken advantage of this at times. Right? The reality is a lot of the things that scientists will say about philosophy or about God in popular media, whether that's in New York Times bestsellers or in Time magazine, on the Discovery Channel, are things that they could never say in a scientific journal, right? They would never write those things in a scientific journal because they wouldn't be credible. However, when they're talking to the general public and not their peers, the public takes scientists as gods, right? And so it's very easy for scientists to rest on their authority. And this is one of the reasons I went into philosophy, is because I wanted to be able to kind of, to some extent, like look more carefully at arguments for important questions like free will. And as a scientist, I wasn't given the skills to do that. Those skills are really properly philosophical skills. So I'll say we can talk a little bit about the Sapolsky book if you want later in the Q&A. But I am going to talk about the basic topic that it addresses, which is determinism and free will. Determinism, in particular, in the context of a sort of scientific worldview, broadly construed. So, is the world determined? And I'm going to define what I mean by those things. So, this first section of the paper is just about what do we mean by free will. And I want to start with Thomas Aquinas and what he says about it, because I think what Thomas Aquinas says is very common sense. So he says, and this is that first quote right under 1, what do we mean by free will? He says, man has free will. Otherwise, counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments would be in vain. Now, one of the things you're going to notice in this article is that that's the only argument Aquinas gives that we have free will. The rest of what he's going to say is explaining what free will is. So I want to pause for a moment and look at what that argument is. The argument is something like this. Well, we do all these things. We give counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments. We do all these things, and they would make no sense if the people that we're doing them to or for have no freedom, if they couldn't do anything else than what they do. And Aquinas thinks that proves that we must have free will. Otherwise, what we do would be ridiculous. Now, there would be more to say about it, and there is more to say about free will than that. And the assertion that the world is deterministic challenges free will from a little bit of a different direction. But for Thomas Aquinas, it was just obvious that we have free will. And there's something to that. You know, anytime we're asking a question about the world, about the universe, we have to start with what seems obvious to us. Now, we've learned, especially with modern science, sometimes what seems obvious to us doesn't turn out to be true. Nevertheless, where else are we going to start? With things that don't make any sense to us? No, we have to start with what seems obvious to us. So Thomas Aquinas goes on. He says, in order to make this evident, we must observe that some things act without judgment, as a stone moves downwards, and in like manner, all things that lack knowledge. Okay, so things that lack knowledge just do what they're compelled to do, with no judgment. Some act from judgment, but not a free judgment, as do brute animals. For the sheep, seeing the wolf, judges it a thing to be shunned, from a natural and not a free judgment. So the sheep, by its instinct, runs from the wolf. It's not that the sheep says, a wolf, would it be best for me to run? No, the sheep immediately acts by instinct and runs from the wolf, in a way that Aquinas doesn't think is free. It's a judgment, though. It judges not from reason, but from natural instinct. And the same thing is to be said of any judgment of brute animals. So Aquinas' thought here is that animals have knowledge, but they have knowledge only of the senses. They see, they hear, they smell. And animals' actions are based on that knowledge. Nevertheless, they're not based on any kind of reasoning, right? So one example I like to give to my students is when you put a steak in front of a dog, the dog will smell the steak. That's knowledge, right? Knowledge of the senses. And the dog will desire the steak in response to that knowledge. The dog will go after the steak only if the dog desires the steak more than it doesn't desire to be punished, right? Because the dog may remember being punished for taking a steak off the counter in the past, right? And if it remembers getting punished and it really doesn't want to be punished, the dog might not take the steak. But whichever one of those feelings is stronger is the one the dog will follow, right? As you might see, you could say it's like it's the vector sum of all the dog's desires is what it will do. It's determined in that sense. It's not determined by the dog's own reasoning. And this is why Aquinas will say that brute animals, meaning animals that are not rational, all animals other than us, do not act freely, even though they do act from a kind of judgment. Okay? Any questions so far? We're going to have questions at the end, but I'm open to questions in the middle if they're brief. Yeah?
Just wondering, with respect to animals' response, our amygdala has certain things in common.
Yeah.
Will you be talking about the amygdala at all?
I won't be talking about the amygdala,
okay.
but I will say this: human beings sometimes act instinctively and reflexively as well. The difference is we don't always.
Okay.
Right? That's the difference between us and other animals. Yes.
And conversely, animals can be trained not to go through that slope until the owner says go.
Right.
And I've seen it with hunting
Right.
dogs.
Right.
It's incredible. So they go against that natural instinct in a way.
Or you produce a new instinct in them is what's going on, something like that. Okay, let me continue with the quote. So, but man, this is the next paragraph there, acts from judgment, because by his apprehensive power, he judges that something should be avoided or sought. But because this judgment in the case of some particular act is not from a natural instinct, but from some act of comparison in the reason, therefore he acts from free judgment and retains the power of being inclined to various things. So, in a given situation, two people might judge that the best thing to do is different. That's because reason is able to come to different conclusions in particular situations. In other words, it's not always clear. There's not like an obvious proof of what the best thing to do is in 99.999% of situations in life, right? As a result, we can act freely because we can reason freely. That's the way Aquinas thinks of free will. For reason, he goes on, for reason in contingent matters may follow opposite courses, as we see in dialectical syllogisms and rhetorical arguments. Now, particular operations are contingent, and therefore in such matters the judgment of reason may follow opposite courses, and is not determinate to one. And forasmuch as man is rational, it is necessary that man have free will. Okay, so for Aquinas, free will is associated with reason. It's also associated, if you think back to the beginning of what we just read, with responsibility, moral responsibility, or with other sorts of normativity. So someone might ask you, could you get me a glass of water? Right? That's a kind of soft command. It would not be rational to do that if you didn't think the person could choose to get the water for you. Right? That's not a moral issue, but it's an issue where a person gets to, as it were, decide what they're going to do. If you look at this next quote is from Peter van Inwagen, who's a philosophy professor at Notre Dame. And I think this is just kind of a common sense explanation of what we mean by free will. So he says, a person has free will if he is often in positions like these. He must now speak or be silent. And he can now speak and can now remain silent. He must attempt to rescue a drowning child or else go for help. And he is able to attempt to rescue the child and able to go for help. he must now resign his chairmanship or else lie to the members. And he has it within his power to resign, and he has it within his power to lie. The point is, we can choose between different possibilities. That's the kind of the essence of free will for Van Inwagen. Okay, so that's what we mean by free will. I hope it's not too surprising. This is I think pretty close to what we generally mean just in common conversation by free will. Okay, section 2. What do we mean by determinism? Okay, so determinism, at least in the way that I'm going to talk about it here, is the conjunction of 3 propositions. When I say it's the conjunction, I mean all 3 of these are true to make determinism true. Okay? A, there exist natural laws that apply universally to every situation in all times and places. Okay? There are natural laws that apply universally in every situation at all times and places. The world is governed by laws of some sort. Okay? B, given a particular initial state of the universe at time t1, so that means a photograph of what the universe is like now, including things like velocity as well, which wouldn't be captured by a normal photograph, but a perfect sort of physical picture of the universe in a moment. Given that, the natural laws constrain the universe to exactly one possible state at time 2 in the future sometime. Okay, so we have natural laws, and those laws are, one way we would put this is they're deterministic laws. They require one particular outcome. They don't leave branching out. They don't leave the universe, as it were, options to go this way or that way. Okay, and then for part, number C is just for all times the state of the universe is determinate. That proposition is just to keep us from saying, well, the universe is in 2 states at the same time. Right? Now, it's sometimes said, quantum mechanics is sometimes interpreted in that way. As, you know, if you've ever heard the story of Schrodinger's cat, there's a story where the cat is both alive and dead at the same time. It's in a superposition of states. I'm not going to get into the details of quantum mechanics, but I will say this. In quantum mechanics, measurements that we make are determined probabilistically by the wave function. And the wave function, which is what describes the motion and energy state of matter and energy, is deterministic. The way in which the wave function changes is deterministic. So it might give a certain probability of finding a particle in one place or another, right? When you actually measure, you might get different results at different times. But if you understand the state of the universe as being the state of the wave function and not the state of any particular measurement, quantum mechanics doesn't contradict determinism. So there's complexities that you could talk about with quantum mechanics. That's what it even means to measure something is a gigantic mystery, and there's different interpretations of it. But I'm not going to get bogged down in that for right now. I think there's a way of understanding quantum mechanics in this which is perfectly compatible with determinism as I've laid it out. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So you're not trying to refute determinism, right?
So far, I just defined determinism.
Okay.
Yeah. I am going to say some things against determinism later. But first, before you refute something, you have to define what it is, right? So that's where I am right now. Yeah.
If it's true that the state of the universe is determinate, does that mean determined by someone, something?
So that doesn't mean determined. So
Okay.
determinate here just means that there is one state of the universe. There's not many states at the same time, right? There's a fact of the matter about the way the universe is right now. Yeah.
That was
Okay, section 3. Are free will and determinism compatible? Now, side note, in Sapolsky's book, he basically assumes that they're not compatible and kind of derides any view that would say otherwise. The reality is there's a huge philosophical literature on the question of whether determinism and free will are compatible or not. I think in the end, the, as it were, incompatibilists win in that debate. But I want to signal that there is a huge debate, which is very interesting and not stupid out there. And one ought not book length treatment, ignore that. However, I'm going to some extent ignore it because it would be way too much to cover in a talk. But I will do I will do this. I'm going to give you what I think is the best argument in the philosophical literature that free will and determinism are not compatible. Okay, and that's this argument, which is known as the consequence argument, due to Peter van Inwagen, 1983. He's written on it, a lot since then, and lots of ink has been spilled on it. But that was the original article. Okay, so this is the way the argument goes. So premise one: if we are free, then our choices make a difference to at least some outcomes in the world. Okay, by that we mean we have some control over some outcomes in the world. So there's something that we control about the way the world is. Okay, premise two: if determinism is true, the past history of the universe plus the laws of nature are jointly sufficient to fix or determine one unique state of the universe for all time. In other words, for all time meaning at every moment in time, that state of the universe is fixed. If you knew the past of the universe, the past history, and if you knew the laws which determine how that past history continues to evolve into the future, then there would be one state of the universe for every time going into the future. Okay, premise three: we have no control over the past history of the universe. Okay, I have no, whatever I mean by control, I haven't defined what I mean by control. To say that I have control over something, it's clear that by any definition of control, I can't control the past, right? So I have no control over the past of the universe. Premise four: we have no control over the laws of nature, right? Again, whatever I mean by control, and again, I haven't defined it specifically, but I don't think I need to, because under any definition of control, I have no control over the laws of the universe, right? The laws of nature. Okay, so I have no control over those two things. Therefore, premise 5 follows from 2, 3, and 4. Therefore, if determinism is true, we never have any control over the state of the universe. Therefore, our choices do not make a difference to any outcome in the world. Okay, because all of those states of the universe are determined by the past and by the laws of nature that exist in the universe. And I don't have control over either of those things. Conclusion is, if determinism is true, then we are not free. Okay, because we have no control over anything that happens. So, I do think that whether or not determinism is true matters. Because if it is true, as far as I can tell, it's not possible for us to have free will. Okay, let me pause for a moment. Any questions about that argument, the way it's supposed to go? Yeah.
Can you flesh out what you mean by laws of nature here? Because it sounds descriptive rather than formative in the way it's used in the Summa.
Yeah. So it's a good question. I mean, it doesn't matter for the argument whether they're descriptive or prescriptive. It seems that some sort of prescriptive view, to me, has to be true, that they're not merely descriptive, because then it would be a coincidence that there would be so much order in our universe, that there's something about these laws that are getting at real regularities, regularities that have some causal basis in the universe. But that's not necessary actually for this argument here. All that's necessary is that the way in which the universe is such that these laws, and I'm talking about, the laws of kinematics, all the way up to the laws of general relativity, any laws of physics, biological laws insofar as they're true and not just approximations. So any laws that describe the way that the empirical world works, the empirically observable world works, would fall here under laws of nature. So I'm not assuming that everything's reducible to physics or anything like that. Whatever the laws are in the end. And determinism, one of the propositions of determinism is that there are laws. And also that they're universal. I'm going to say it's something about a philosopher later on who challenges the universality of natural law. But does that help? Does that answer your question?
It's still not a certain dictative reason, order to the common good by him who has the care.
Oh, no, yeah.
So in
This
this
is-
context, when you start with Thomas, I'm trying to avoid that confusion.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm using laws in the modern sense. From the point of view of Thomas, a law of nature would be, it would be a law by analogy, right? By analogy with, the principal kind of law, which is political. Yeah, and I think even in modern context, like the word law principally means something political, but it's become so common to speak of natural regularities in terms of law that kind of gloss over. So yes, good point. Not to be confused with law and politics. Okay, section 4. This is very short, but I just want to say what would follow if determinism is true. And I do want to suggest that if determinism is true, life looks kind of bleak and meaningless. So what Aquinas says, and this is just reversing what he said in that first quotation that I had, if determinism is true, then we're not free. But we are not. If we're not free, counsels, exhortations, commands, prohibitions, rewards, and punishments are all in vain. In other words, to say they're in vain just means they don't make any sense. We issue commands, we blame, we punish, we do all these things because we are determined to do them. And there is no point in, for example, writing a book and urging people not to punish others because it's not their fault, because they're all determined, right? Which is one of the things that Sapolsky does in his book, is he says it's a moral imperative that we not punish because people aren't responsible, they were all determined, right? Problem is, as soon as you talk about moral imperatives, you're presupposing free will, right? You're presupposing the people you talk to can do something other than what they were determined to do. Right? Otherwise, what's the goal? So if determinism is true, then it's not clear that there's a reason for us to care about that or to go around and trumpet it, because it's not going to change anything. Right? Nothing we do can change anything. And I think it's important to realize too that if you argue that determinism is true, if you're right, you're just determined to argue that. It's not necessarily because you have good arguments, it's because that's the way nature has determined you to argue. And so those are pretty unattractive consequences, I think, for a scientist or a philosopher, because we all like to make arguments, we like to come to conclusions, right? And when all of our conclusions, all of our arguments are predetermined by nature, if that's really true, well, golly, it's a pretty cool machine that's playing itself out in our universe, but I don't have any control over it. I'm not, as it were, an agent in that. Okay, so the final section of what is the longest section of what I want to say, and that's the question: is determinism true? So, if I'm right, if Peter Van Inwagen is right, that determinism and free will are incompatible, then the question of whether determinism is true is an important one. Okay, and I'm going to give some reasons to doubt that determinism is true. The first one I want to give is something that goes back to Aristotle. So Aristotle noticed that certain things in the universe, in the world around him, seem to be unified in a special way. Take, for example, a squirrel. A squirrel is made of a bunch of tiny little particles, right? Cells or atoms or molecules or whatever you want to say. It's made of a bunch of different pieces. And those pieces all work together for some sort of goal. And the goal seems to be for the squirrel to flourish and mate and reproduce, right? And the puzzle that Aristotle saw here is how is the squirrel held together? It's easy to take life for granted and not to marvel at this, that there are these things that are held together for years on end, these conglomerations of bits that somehow are seeking after an end on their own. Aristotle thought this wasn't explainable except in terms of what he called the soul. Okay? A soul for Aristotle is not a little ghost in the thing. It's some sort of a motivating force in the thing that holds it together and moves the squirrel through its life. Makes it look for nuts, look for mates, makes it sleep and drink and eat and do all the things that squirrels do in order to survive and flourish. Aristotle thought that it couldn't just be that the parts happen to work together in that way. Now, a typical understanding of what's called naturalism, which is naturalism is the view that everything is just nature as we understand it. The typical version of naturalism is what I would call reductionism, which is the idea that actually, in fact, all there is the little things. And a squirrel is just a whole bunch of little particles moving in this magnificently complex way over time and doing what a squirrel does. So in a way, against Aristotle, what reductionist naturalism would say is that there is no squirrel really. There's just the little bits of the squirrel. Squirrel is a kind of shorthand for all those bits together, right? But it's not like there's some unified thing there that drives itself. No, everything is driven from the bottom up, from the small stuff up. So those are basically the two views. Now, Aristotle would reject what I have as 2a here. So that is back in section 2 there, that there exist natural laws that apply universally to every situation, all times and places. Because the idea here would be that no, the squirrel is governed by its soul. It's a unified thing, and what the squirrel does is not governed simply by natural law. Okay? Now, this is a view that many people would say is proved wrong by modern science. Okay? However, the difficulty with that is that in order to say that modern science has proved it wrong, you have to make a tremendous extrapolation from controlled systems of maybe 3 or at most 4 bodies in a laboratory to billions of cells and hundreds of billions of smaller particles in a squirrel. And you have to say that these laws that we find that hold over 3 bodies in a laboratory also hold in this other case. Now, maybe they do, but that's an extrapolation, right? And an Aristotelian view of nature would say, we're not justified in making that extrapolation. We don't have enough evidence to say that, in fact, the laws of nature apply exactly the same way to all the particles in a squirrel, and there's no higher level governance of what the squirrel does. That extrapolation goes too far. So that's a point of contention. And there are scientists on both sides of that question, and philosophers on both sides of that question. And if Aristotle is right, determinism is not true. Or at least, if it is true, there would have to be a lot more research to figure out how it could be. Right? Because the soul isn't the soul of the squirrel is working for the squirrel's good. It's not following mathematical laws. Okay. Any questions about what I'm saying there? Yeah.
For this argument to work to disprove determinism, would you have to show? So in the beginning, you differentiate between free will that humans have and then like natural instinct that animals have. And it seems like in the instance of the squirrel, right, then that's more on the natural instinct side. And so you have to say not only are free will and determinism incompatible, but like natural instinct and determinism are incompatible. Is that with those? Would you have to go that step further to show that this?
Oh, that's good. I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, although the thing is what natural. The question is really about what natural instinct is. Nobody contests that there is natural instinct in the squirrel, but the reductionist is going to give a deterministic account of that from the bottom up, whereas an Aristotelian would give a top-down account that it's the squirrel that causes its parts to work in a particular way, not the parts causing the squirrel. So that would be the point of contention. So it wouldn't be so yes, the kind of natural instinct that an Aristotelian would accept would be incompatible with determinism. So I think that's absolutely right. Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to form this correctly, this question, but
Yeah.
maybe I should just wait to the end. But if you say, I don't hear you saying that determinism is not compatible with creationism. So what if you said, okay, fine, there's a creator that made the soul of a squirrel. You're not necessarily saying, well, I would expect a squirrel to act like a dog or a human. A squirrel's a squirrel, but it can still act in deterministic ways based on the fact that it's a squirrel. And so you can observe that, and if you had infinite computing power, you could say, okay, well, squirrels behave this way, humans behave this way, and I can still therefore extrapolate to the nth degree what's going to be the future or whatever, right?
Okay, so is your question about, is it about the creator? Or is it about, so I'm not, it seems like there are a few questions in there.
The premise here, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but it says here are some reasons to think determinism is not true.
Yeah.
I'm sort of struggling to find why these would refute determinism as opposed to just making determinism, maybe a different complexity or a different sort of.
So you could imagine a soul being such that the soul, well, there could be another level of determinism enforced by the soul, depending upon the way in which the soul
that's
behaves.
Not what I'm saying, yeah.
But that would be, but I don't think that that's intuitively compelling. But more would have to be said about whether squirrels behave deterministically or not. Now, to say that a squirrel is not free is not the same as to say it's deterministic, right? Because so determinism is a straitjacket that confines the thing to one possibility from below, as it were. Its particles force it to act in a particular way, right? It could be that the squirrel is still forced to act in a particular way, but the way in which it's forced to act is not mathematically modelable per se, right? The squirrel responds to situations in terms of what the squirrel's good is. As I put it before, it kind of responds according to the vector sum of its feelings. And if its feelings are fundamentally deterministic, then you could have another determinism on top of that.
So I don't want to drag this on, but I was going to say with the free will argument, it seems to me that you could also just say, again, with enough computing power, if you said, okay, so a squirrel only has a set, you use this example of the dog in a steak. Okay, so a dog in a steak, it has very limited sort of, like you said, sensory inputs of, smell, sight, and this is how it sort of forms its worldview, its decision tree. But a human, because our brains are so much stronger and, we take in more information, and it's a lot more complex, but I think people would make the argument that free will is sort of almost an illusion. They would say, well, if you had infinite computing power, you could actually map all those variables, and you could say at the end of the day, it's still from the bottom up in a sense, or so it still seems kind of deterministic. It's just that we, observing ourselves, we can't actually see all those different variables that we're making every single millisecond.
Yeah, that would be the determinist argument, is that all of our I mean, they would surely concede that human minds are more complex, but it's all determined from the bottom up by the way the particles behave. That would be the determinist view. Aristotle's view is different from that because it says no, the behavior of the particles is governed by the soul of the squirrel. It's governed in a top-down way. That might not be incompatible with the kind of determinism in a squirrel. In humans, it would be, though, because of the fact that our reason can go different directions. It's not determined to one thing. That's why people make different judgments in the same situation. So yeah, I mean, the view that it's governed from the bottom up is just the deterministic view, and that's the view. And to be clear, none of these are supposed to be knockdown arguments against determinism. There are reasons to think determinism is not true, because ultimately, right, there's an empirical question of whether things actually do behave exactly as the laws of nature from the bottom up determine them to behave, right? It's an empirical question that we can't answer because it requires far more sensitive instruments and far more like sophisticated mathematics than we have. Like literally the kind of mathematics we need is we're not able to do the computations, even for a three-body system, like evolving over a long period of time. So it's not, even though it is theoretically an empirical question, because we can't answer it empirically, I'm trying to give considerations why we might think that, well, there's some reason to think that the world isn't determined. And okay, so that's what Aristotle would say. This second one here is, I think, this is the one that I think is the weakest of the ones that I give, because ultimately, the implausibility of abiogenesis is not necessarily have immediate consequences for free will. But, so the question is here, could the first living thing have come to exist by chance? So by chance, what I mean really is by natural law, deterministically. Essentially, if we, given the size of the universe and the history of the universe, could this first living thing have come into existence just by little bits of particles moving randomly throughout, billions, maybe trillions of star systems, planets, whatever. So the neo-Darwinian theory, even if it does give us a complete explanation of the diversity of living things that we find now, requires a first organism to get started. So that first organism, Darwin can't help us with getting that thing to be. And once you have it, it can pass on its genes, and once you have something that can reproduce, so I list it here, such an organism has to be able to have something like genetic information, to be able to reproduce itself and hand on its genetic information, and to be able to survive long enough to do so. Okay, so something like that has to come into existence seemingly by chance somewhere in the universe in order for this whole process to get off the ground. And the question is, the universe is deterministic, and deterministic causes are the only things going on. Could you get something that complex by chance, even given the amount of time and the size of the universe? It's a very difficult question for our minds to wrap themselves around. But, I will just say that the abiogenesis is a theory of life from non-life, right? I don't think it would be correct to call that a theory, though, because we can't really show how it's speculation. It's a speculation that needs to be true if naturalism is true. Right? If determinism and naturalism are true, there is no God, there are no special forces that bring about life in the universe, it's just particles in fields of force. If that's true, then it needs to be the case that life came about by chance, somewhere, and somehow was able to survive long enough to evolve in the way that Darwin describes, Darwin and Darwinism describes. I'm very skeptical about that. I'm very skeptical that we're going to find an explanation, actually, for how that could happen. But this is why I say I don't want to put a lot of weight on this one. It's a tough question because the universe is huge, right? And there's been a lot of time. Okay, Nancy Cartwright. So Nancy Cartwright is a really interesting philosopher. She was at Stanford for a while. She's at Durham in England now. She's getting close to retirement. So Nancy Cartwright argues that based on our observations of the world around us, we do not have good reason to believe either that the laws of nature apply to exactly the same way everywhere, or that they are deterministic in nature. Okay? So Nancy Cartwright is an empiricist. She is not a religious person at all, but she thinks so. She has this book, The Dabbled World, in which she argues that the laws of nature are not deterministic in the way that we usually think about them, nor are they universal. They apply differently in different places. And she says, this is what we observe in the world, in the field of psychology, in the field of biology, the field of fluid dynamics. In each one of these places, we can't use the same laws to describe what's going on. There's this grand idea that the laws are all ultimately reducible to physics. All that's really going on is physics. But Nancy Cartwright says, where is the evidence for that? The only evidence for it is that it would be really cool if it were the case, right? Everything would be so simple. But Cartwright thinks the world's messy. And what's interesting about her view and what's challenged scientists and philosophers of science by it is that she's right that there isn't clear empirical evidence for the universality of the laws of nature. What a scientist, if he's honest, when he or she is honest, will say is that it's beautiful. It would be beautiful if all the laws were reducible to a few simple ones, right? Cartwright just says their idea of beauty is different than mine, right? So she's a very interesting thinker, and I think that she has a point to make, because the point she's making is an empirical one. It's essentially it's very similar to the one that I made in talking about Aristotle, the extrapolation from very simple systems that seem to be governed deterministically to, she gives the example of a dollar bill dropped in St. Peter's Square that just sort of floats down, and this is in St. Petersburg actually. It wasn't St. Peter's Square in Rome, but in St. Petersburg, in the Hughes Piazza, dollar bill is dropped. Is it deterministic how the dollar bill will float down to the ground? And she points out that we have no laws that can actually make the prediction of how it will fly. And she says that's evidence that we may not be justified in saying that it is deterministic. Interesting. Sometimes I don't know if I completely buy all of her arguments, but she makes an interesting empirical point. Okay, I want to end with some arguments from Brian Cutter, who's a professor at Notre Dame. Brian is an interesting guy because he grew up atheist and he converted to Catholicism in graduate school when he was in graduate school at the UT Austin. And some of these are some of the arguments that brought him around away from naturalism and eventually to Catholicism. But first really just to a belief in God. So Brian says, so this is the first argument, one of the ones he said was really influential on him. He says, to deny free will, we would need to deny one of the following claims from which the reality of free will follows. First, we sometimes do things that we are morally obligated not to do. Okay? So in other words, we sometimes break the moral law. We do immoral things. Number two, we are morally obligated not to do something only if we are able not to do it. Right? So people, like beings that are not able to do anything different, are not morally obligated to anything because they couldn't act differently. A moral obligation presupposes choice, control over the result of one's actions. Okay, and then he goes on to say, what? 1 and 2 are both extremely plausible. So this is the way he started to reason, is he was a naturalist and a determinist, essentially. And he came to believe that determinism is not compatible with free will. And then he asked himself a simple question. He asked the question like, what am I more certain of? That I have free will or that naturalism is true? And he said, I feel like 95% certain that naturalism is true, but I also feel like it's impossible for me to deny that I have free will. Because, he believes that there are moral truths. Morality is real. He doesn't necessarily think he knows all the moral truths, but he believes that there are some. The example he gives in his article is torturing children for fun is wrong. He said, I am more certain that that is true, than I am that naturalism is true, even though I was like 95% sure that naturalism is true. He said, at the end of the day, if holding on to naturalism is going to require me to give up the belief that torturing children for fun is wrong, he's like, I gotta let go of naturalism. Of course, as soon as you do that, then you start asking, all of a sudden, all the religious views that you had taken off the table because you're a naturalist come back into play. And you start having to say, okay, naturalism is false. So his idea was just essentially that, here's two beliefs. One I'm really, really sure about, and one that I can't deny. I can't deny this one, and they're incompatible, right? So I have to deny this one. So here's another way. This is my own sort of interpretation of his argument. Another way to put Cutter's argument as it relates to determinism. So if naturalism is true, then determinism is true. By the way, naturalism in itself doesn't require determinism. If you can believe that everything is natural, there's no God, there's no supernatural, but the world is not deterministic. However, premise A there is based on the fact that I've never met a naturalist that believes that, right? Even though logically you could believe that, naturalists typically also believe that the laws of nature are deterministic, at least in the sense that I named at the beginning, setting aside quantum mechanics. So if naturalism is true, then determinism is true, basically. If determinism is true, then I don't have free will. Okay, I argued that before. Therefore, if naturalism is true, then I do not have free will. Okay? Premise D, but I do have free will. Right? And this is just, for Brian, this was just it wasn't that he had proved that he had free will. It was just that looking inside of himself, he could not deny his own freedom. He said, my immediate experience of freedom is so much more certain to me than any conclusion I draw about naturalism. So therefore he concludes naturalism is therefore not true. Okay, this is actually this argument was he's told me, I baptized one of his children. So we're friends. I mean, he told me this was hugely influential on not his conversion, because it didn't lead to his conversion immediately, but it led to him letting go of naturalism. Because before that, he held a view that basically naturalism is where you start, and everything else is interpreted through it, and you never question naturalism. This is what first made him question it, because he said, these two things that I believe are incompatible. So he's also sympathetic with two related arguments that deal with naturalistic interpretations of the theory of evolution. So versions that exclude the involvement of a creator. But these two arguments both end up rejecting naturalistic evolution by rejecting naturalism, not by rejecting evolution. So he doesn't reject evolution, but as an empirical observation. But he does reject certain versions of it. So the first is an argument from our knowledge of moral truth. This is going to go back to moral truth and ultimately to free will as well. So if naturalistic evolution is true, then it would be a wild coincidence for us to have knowledge of any moral truths, since evolution doesn't select for moral knowledge, but for survivability. Okay, so the thought is that moral truths are not things that we learn by being able to survive. Now, it might be that certain things that are useful for survival happen to correspond with morality, but evolution doesn't select for being moral, it selects fundamentally for surviving. And so if all those are is survival truths, well, Brian's going to say they're not. They're not really moral truths if I only understand them as being good for survival. So it would be a coincidence. And there's a number of philosophers who arguing against morality, really, in the literature, saying that they're called evolutionary debunking arguments. Arguments from evolution that debunk morality. That say, we have no reason to believe that what we believe about moral truth is true, based on where it came from. If it came through random mutation and natural selection, neo-Darwinian kind of explanation of it, we have no reason to believe that we're right about morality. And Brian thinks that that's true, but that takes it as a refutation of naturalism, not of morality. Right? That understanding of evolution as blind and mechanistic, with no sort of God at the back of it, is bankrupt and can't support our belief in moral truths. Okay, so it's a total coincidence. Premise 2, we do have knowledge of some moral truths. 3, we should not believe in wild coincidences. And 4, therefore, we should reject naturalism or deny that we have knowledge of any moral truths. We'll do one of those two. And Brian chooses to reject naturalism because he thinks we are more certain that morality is real. Okay, let's move on. The second and the last argument he gives deals with our ability to do science. So there's been a number of philosophers and scientists who have observed that given the way that our universe seems to work, and given the way that we seem to have evolved, it seems like an amazing coincidence that we have minds that are able to grasp the universe at the depth that we seem to be able to do. Our ability to do science at the level we can do it is astounding, given that all that evolution selects for is survivability, right? It's just selecting for things that can survive and reproduce their genes. Why would it turn out that we can understand the universe in the way that we can? And a lot of people think that this is just a blind coincidence. This is just an amazing coincidence. But this argument essentially says, well, if naturalistic evolution is true, then it's a wild coincidence that we have minds with such an amazing capacity to do science. Second premise, we do have minds with an amazing capacity to do science. And then 3, we shouldn't believe in wild coincidences. Therefore, naturalism is false. So, it's interesting that the arguments that Brian Cutter is giving here are not arguments that are going directly against scientific claims that the world is deterministic. Right? He's not really engaging people who say, well, it looks like natural laws govern everything, right? He's not engaging those in the way that Nancy Cartwright or Aristotle would. He's just saying, look, I can't deny that I have free will. Therefore, I have to reject any view that's incompatible with it, and determinism is incompatible with it. The thought is that we, sort of what I said at the very beginning, which is that in investigating the universe, we have to start with what is most intuitively obvious to us, right? And it can be overturned potentially, but there's a burden of proof, right? The things that we know with more certainty are going to require a much higher burden of proof. And the arguments for naturalism and determinism just aren't strong enough to overturn, at least for him, his conviction that he has free will and that morality is real. Okay, I'm going to stop there. It's been, let's see, it's been almost an hour, so maybe we can do some more Q&A.
So do we clap first?
Oh, you can clap first.
I would like to tell people you're free to leave. So if people don't want to be here for the Q&A, you can get up and walk out and leave.
Because he's going to leave, that's why I
No, I'm not. I have to turn the lights off. I have the key. So, no, but now if you have to leave at any time, you're more than welcome to. No,
Please feel free, yeah.
Yeah, okay. It's all yours.
Yeah, back there.
So if there's no free will, how to explain things like conscience or altruism or love?
Altruism can be a challenge, actually, for sort of naturalistic explanations. Conscience, I mean, so generally what people will try to say is like, well, it's a kind of herd instinct that comes to us from like sort of rules of behavior in the herd that have become more sophisticated, and that that our minds have somehow taken to another level in imputing this sort of magical moral power, moral value to them. Altruism is a little bit more tricky, but a determinist would point to something like, the mother bear defending her cubs, or generally animals being willing to sacrifice themselves for their young, for example, which is something that comes from instinct. And maybe, it gets really difficult when you try to explain why would someone, put it this way. Once you get culture, you can explain it through peer pressure. The problem is that even to get culture, you have to already have like some sort of moral system. Culture as opposed to just like the herd instinct. So it's a little bit of a challenge, but I mean, it kind of depends on what you think is plausible.
I mean, for people who make donations of organs to people who they've never met, for people who make donations of organs to people who they've never met, for Maxine Colby, who gave up his life to people. I mean, so.
I mean, these are things that, in our just human experience, that seem to point towards the ability to choose. I mean, I would say that even more than those things, it's just my immediate sense that I have a choice about the things I do each day. And I mean, it's going to take a lot to convince me that that's not true, because it just seems so immediately obvious to me in a way that, like, I'm going to have a really strong argument to convince me out of that, yeah.
Are there constraints on free will? I guess when I'm thinking about structural and functional differences in brain anatomy, for example, with psychopaths who have reduced, amygdala volume, prefrontal cortex, reasoning, judgment, impulsivity, that they're driven to do.
Repeat the question for the people.
So she said, are there constraints on free will? And she gave examples of people with different sized amygdalas, people who are psychotic, then there's or psychopathic that have differences in their brains. So I don't know all the neuroscience of that stuff.
Yeah.
I think that believing in free will doesn't mean we believe that there are not tons of influences acting on us other than our freedom, right? I think it's crystal clear that there are lots of influences on us from our past that make us you know, it's not like we sit in this perfectly neutral position and make choices with no other influences. And so, you know, the psychopath may have had tons and tons of past influencing them in various ways, which is not to deny that they have free will. It's just to say
that's
that
more like a sociopath.
Okay, well, I know.
You know, well, psychopath. I mean, there are definite structural abnormalities.
Are they?
It gets
Okay.
to the moral and legal, and I guess you know, questions about are they responsible? I mean,
Yeah. Those are hard questions. I mean, the way that we deal with it is a very blunt way, which is to speak of insanity, right? But what is insanity? What counts as insanity? Those are definitely difficult questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you cite any material that would help someone engage with someone around apologetics that incorporate these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, you can. So she asked if you can cite someone, some sources that could help people with apologetics in talking to other people about this. You know, I don't have a specific source for you to, but I would go to Catholic Answers, because they have lots of good apologetic stuff, and on every single topic. You know, I'm sure you're going to find some stuff there. I guess this talk was intended to go a little bit beyond just the merely apologetic, and to look at some actual philosophical and scientific theories that suggest determinism is not true. But I think Catholic Answers is a great resource for that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you say to the question, when does a human have free will? Like, thinking about the different stages of a human. For instance,
Yeah.
does a newborn baby have free will?
Good question. Really good question. So, for Aquinas, there's some finer distinctions to be made between the ability to choose freely and actually being a rational animal. So an infant is already a rational animal. The infant does not have the use of its rationality yet, though. Right? So it's possible to have a power but not be able to use the power. Right? I mean, if I may pick you out, you have the power to run, but right now you're not able to use it, right? Because you're injured. So it's possible to have a power but not be able to use it. An infant has the power of rationality and freedom, but it's not able to exercise those powers yet because its brain hasn't developed. It also needs to learn language, things like this. But the question of when that begins, well, I mean, thinking about it from a Thomistic perspective, once the infant can understand well enough to know, like, this is good and this is bad, the infant has free will by that point, right? When is that? Well, we say the age of reason is 7 years old. I don't know. I mean,
6 months.
I will leave it to the mothers in the room to make a judgment about this, but I suspect it's before 7 years old.
When they can say no.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think I forgot what I wanted to say, and I really wanted to say it.
Okay, come back. Did you have a question?
Yeah, one of them is to go to the second argument about, I can't remember now what, deals our ability to do science.
Our ability to do science, yeah.
Okay, but we have ability to do more than, okay, our ability to do science is like purely a function of survival. Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's related to.
Well, it's hard.
Do
So
what we
my
need
point,
to do in order to survive.
Yeah, my point is that it doesn't make sense that evolution would select for more than what we need to do to survive.
But what need for survival do we have for art, for music? We have ability for music, to create art, to create love. Love I can see because it forms familial bonds and all that kind of stuff is necessary for survival. But is art necessary for physical survival?
This is a good point. I think that people like to use science rather than art because people worship scientists and they think science is incredible And I mean, it's amazing what science has done in the past 400 years, right? So I think that rhetorically, that argument is often the one that's more turned to than art. I think you can raise an analogous question about art too, though. Like, this is very unpractical for survival and things like this. And you find art way, way back in human history, right? It's like cave art 40,000 years back that doesn't seem to have, like...
That wasn't putting food on the table.
That's right, that's exactly, yeah. So I don't know, I think there is perhaps an argument to be made there. Let's see. Do you have a question?
I do. So I might have missed it, but you kept saying that basically, if you believe in naturalism or determinism, that you it basically precludes believing in God as well, right?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay, well, there.
I think it precludes a belief in the God that we believe in, but okay. You could imagine a God that created a kind of ant farm universe, right? That's just completely deterministic, and he just wants to watch it go.
Well, or
right?
Or maybe, he's still the unmoved mover. He can still put his finger and move stuff around if he wants, but we're still living the laws of nature, as it were.
I don't think it excludes the possibility. I don't know of anybody that. Well, I should say no. There are people who believe in a God like that. That believe the universe is deterministic or close to deterministic.
But the Catholic God isn't that way.
No, the Catholic God loves us and wants us to love Him, and love requires free will.
I'm missing the point where those are exclusive.
Yeah. So in order to love, in order for us to love Him, we have to be able to freely choose to love Him. He doesn't want to just create beings that will love Him as sort of automatons, right? He gave us freedom. He even gave the angels freedom in the beginning to choose for or against Him. So that's what the love requires that. But you could imagine a God, a sort of first mover sort of God that doesn't care about love. I mean, I think it's actually probably impossible, right? But I don't think our minds can see that it's impossible. It's not, obviously so. Hold on, I want to get somebody. Was there another hand over here? Somebody hasn't asked a question? Okay, in the red shirt, yeah.
It would be interesting to see how someone who proclaims to not believe in free will would go about raising teenagers. I mean,
I defer to you on that.
Yeah.
I have more experience being a teenager than raising them. And I will say that I do have pity for my parents. Yeah.
I remembered what it was. How would determinism or naturalism explain supernatural occurrences like the resurrection, healings?
Well, I mean, look, a naturalist is going to say, look, the resurrection happened 2,000 years ago. Yes, there were these eyewitnesses, but who knows if they were telling the truth, maybe they were crazy, right? There's arguments in response to that, but you can't, go back with a camera and video it happening, right? And so the determinist is going to say, well, there's been lots of superstitious things that have happened throughout the history of the world.
Healings right in front of someone.
Yeah, well, I think that for most of us, if we see a healing right in front of us, it's going to have an effect on us. But testimonies of healings, well, you find those in lots of religions, right? And I don't know what happened in any particular case. So that's probably what they're going to say. And then to some extent, we should be skeptical, I think, about miracles. I think we should be really quick to just believe miracles happen, right? The church even requires evidence. Yes. Requires there to be testimony and evidence that this is actually authentic and real.
But if the burden of proof was on the miracle being real, then how would it be explained by determinism?
So I don't know. I think it would depend upon the situation. If you ask someone who's a determinist or a naturalist how they explain any given case, you'd have to see how they did it, right?
Oh, okay.
But lots of weird stuff happens in the world that we don't explain. And I think that's what they would say, probably, right? Is that I don't know why, what the cause of this or that. And it's fair to say I don't know everything about what caused what in the world. I just think they would say, on balance, we live in a naturalistic world. I think that's what the evidence points to. Would be probably what they'd say.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this judgment is from some act of comparison in the reason.
Yeah.
And I'm used to comparison only being about particulars. And granted, that's most of our ethical reasoning. We've done it here tonight, bringing up Maximilian Kolbe, and we use that as an example and say, how can I be like, Maximilian Kolbe in this situation? But Thomas also allows for reason from universals. So I'm curious what comparison is doing or meaning here.
So the comparison he's talking about is going to be a comparison of particulars. Because there could be comparison of universals. There always is comparison of universals involved because the intellect only knows universals. But for Thomas, you have something called the cogitative power. The cogitative power is this magical power that's not, a lot more work needs to be done on this, on what it's supposed to do in Aquinas. It's like the glue that puts together our senses, which only perceive the particular, and our intellect, which only knows the universal. And the cogitative power is what allows and is able to make our ability to understand universally in our intellect useful, as it were, in making decisions and this sort of comparison of things in the actual world. Because like a dog has a kind of comparison that it does, but it's not free. It's just, which feeling is stronger, right? But the cogitative power can actually kind of think with help of the intellect. Yeah. It's a good question. It's a good question, yeah. Yeah.
So with reference to 2A, 2A.
A little louder, please.
Yeah, so
2A.
2A, which says there exist natural laws that apply universally to every situation, in all times, in all places. That seems to be something that any scientist would hold. Like an average person would believe that there are physical laws that apply to material objects in a consistent way. Right?
Yeah.
If I hold that, and also that I have free will, does that necessarily entail belief in an immaterial something, at least an immaterial portion of me that comes up with events outside of the causal chain? Does belief in free will entail a belief in an immaterial realm, let's say?
I think it does, but I don't think that I've made the argument for that. And I was trying to avoid it because I do think that the claim about natural laws is already contradicted by Aristotle's view of substance, which there are scientists and philosophers who, and I think Nancy Cartwright's arguments are particularly strong in this regard, who reject what would be the majority view, which is that all of these laws just apply everywhere in exactly the same way. Why do we think that? Not because we've examined every place, and because we can do the calculations in a squirrel to show that it's true, but because it would be very simple and elegant if that were the case.
So they'd relegate it to assumption. This is
well, it is an assumption, but it's a widespread assumption.
Yeah.
It's a very widespread assumption, but it's not assumption. I think you can plausibly argue that it's not an assumption that's given to us by the science. It's an assumption that so a lot of science, when you start to study the history of science, a lot of science is done on a lot of the most groundbreaking science was done because the scientists thought it would be beautiful if this were true. Right? This is what Einstein said completely unabashedly. I said it would be much more beautiful if things fit together this way. Bam! Look, the math works out. Fast forward 80 years, or a few decades in some cases, and right up until the beginning of the 21st century. In other cases, we empirically proved that he was right. Whole other thing. Why is our sense of beauty so accurate in these cases? However, it's not that it's not that we can prove it empirically that those are the case, that those situations are the case. And you could argue, in this case, that it's actually more beautiful if a squirrel is really a squirrel, and not just a bunch of little particles, but if it's something new arising out of physical stuff. Yeah, it's a good question though, because I don't know if we have any scientists here, but I would invite pushback of that kind because I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah. Burnham. I think it's. I mean, okay. So I was going to say this earlier, but it just seems. Look, there's natural law, but extrapolating from natural law to natural instinct to naturalism, it seems like you've gone wild. You've gone from the tiny amounts we know with. I'm not going to say natural law. I'm going to say the models of the universe as we understand it to free will. It's like it's taking leaps of the universe to get to where you get free will. And to say we're bound, we are bound. We're limited as humans. We can't go back in time as far as we know. Right? Our models of our existence that we can't transcend gravity, which we don't even know what gravity is. We just have a nice placeholder word, right? We love to have supersymmetry, it makes sense, because isn't it nice and beautiful? But that doesn't mean it's true, right? It's like wanting doesn't mean it's going to happen. So I'm like this extrapolation. It's like, yeah, we have some nice models of the universe. They seem to work, but that doesn't preclude free will. I can't go back in time. It does not preclude free will.
Yeah, although the thing that does seem to preclude free will is the deterministic view of the universe. And that is well rooted in a lot of scientific thinking. This idea that ultimately these laws are universal, they apply everywhere, and they're simple and mechanistic.
But we don't, not like F equals MA, you know, that's actually my major equation of the life. Look, and it only applies under certain models. And we have quantum mechanics, which only, again, applies to a different level.
Yeah.
So, and then to say it's deterministic, it's like, no, it's not. You know, double pendulum is chaotic. I do this for a living. It's like, we can't, you talk about the dollar bill flowing. You can't even figure out how far baseball flies. With air resistance.
Right. But the determinist is going to say in response to that, they're going to say that's just because we can't measure precisely enough and do the calculations.
No, that is wishful thinking.
Well, this is what Nancy Cartwright says. She says that's an assertion and it's an extrapolation from what we actually do know to this thing that you want to be true. I really recommend her book, The Dappled World. It's very, very interesting because she's very persuasive. But I think that my goal here is not to say that I can prove determinism is false empirically. I don't claim that, right? My goal is to say that is to convince you that there are reasons to think that it's not obviously true from our empirical knowledge. And the fact that it's incompatible with free will makes me think it's false. Right? Well, and lots of other things make me think it's false. But yeah.
You mentioned earlier, to me, a persuasive comment that the people like Sapolsky or Sam Harris who argue against free will, they still write books and exhort people to follow their argument.
Yeah.
Have you heard any convincing or interesting reasons why they write books?
You know, I don't know what they say to that. Lots of people make that point. It's not all original to me. But like, I mean, Sapolsky just baldly says that part of his reason for writing this book is moral. Like the central reason for writing it is to convince people that we're not responsible and so we shouldn't punish people anymore. And it's like, well, shouldn't? That implies that because of your book, I can change my mind. Which implies I have free will.
It seems like an important thing to answer. I tried to read Sam Harris's short book on free will, or that there isn't free will.
Yeah.
But in the introduction, he says something like, you're thinking that you have autonomy is illusory. You have no more control over what you think than I have in writing the next words of this page.
Yeah.
So I couldn't go past that.
It's like, why? What's the point?
There must be.
If you're right.
Some attempt to.
I'd have to honestly dig a little bit to give you an answer to that. I don't actually know off the top of my head. Okay. Yes.
So, how would philosophers in this area discussing these things deal with or think of chaos theory or quantum mechanics or so like how do those things fall?
Well, I mean, each one of those things you have to know something about them in order to talk about them. And philosophers generally realize that. Sometimes they overstep. But I mean, generally, if those things are going to be pillars of your actual professional philosophical work, you got to go learn some physics.
No, but the question is, do those fall in the world of determinism, or would they say, oh, this is something that could fall within the laws of nature, and that they apply differently at different places?
I mean, chaos theory, so the thing about chaos theory is that theoretically, if it's in a classical regime, like it's the thought would be it's still deterministic, it's just that the numbers blow up so fast that there's no hope of being able to understand it deterministically, of being able to model it, right? So chaos theory is not, as I understand it, ontologically indeterminate, according to a determinist. If the laws are applying, the laws themselves, the math just gets exponentially more complicated to the point where our predictive power goes out the window. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not deterministic itself. It's just that we can't, whatever determinism is there is no use to us because it's so much more complicated than could ever be useful for predictions. Quantum mechanics is a different thing, and a more complex and controversial thing that, I mean, the jury is still out on what's going on, what the physical interpretation of quantum mechanics is. But I think the point I made would be agreed upon by everyone, which is that the wave function itself that describes the outcomes of measurements, what the probabilities, gives you the basis for, the probabilities of different outcomes. The wave function itself evolves deterministically. So that, there is still kind of overarching determinism that's contained even in quantum mechanics, but whether that ultimately implies the kind of determinism I'm talking about here, lots of questions about what a measurement is, what their relevance are to the actual world. Do they depend upon our consciousness? What's going on there? And I don't know enough about it to have a strong opinion, honestly. Yes?
There are a lot of things you talked about that I don't understand.
That's fine.
But I kept thinking to myself, I wonder if you're kind of an anomaly out there in the world, being a Catholic priest and talking with people who are giving these persuasive arguments for other ways of explaining our existence. And with that, I wondered, what was it that was the crux of your faith, your choice to believe in something that involves free will and God?
Yeah. So first of all, I would say I'm not an anomaly. There's lots of philosophers, not as many priests, but
that's what I meant.
But there's lots of philosophers and scientists that
believe, that
understand, and not just believe, but also would make arguments similar to the ones I'm making. But for me, I mean, I think if I start telling my story, that's going to get us off track, and we're already kind of late. So I think that might be for something to come and ask me afterwards about it, if you like.
Okay, that would.
Maybe we should wrap it up. There's one last question.
Yeah, one more, then we'll.
Back here.
All right. So.
No,
it's not that. That's not my intention at all.
No.
I guess the reason why I was so interested in coming to this is because this is a topic that I struggle with a lot, because I do believe in the Catholic faith. I'm not yet baptized, but I'm working on that right now. And this is one of these things that keep hanging me up. This, like, if we and so I guess it comes down to God Himself. If He is all powerful and all knowing, right? Mm-hmm. Then what is it that He's all powerful and all knowing of? It should be, the natural world, the things that He's created, the entire creation, everything, right? So by that, would it not reason that there is a law to everything, there is rules to everything, and He's knowing of these things?
Yeah.
What is it? I mean, unless we just sort of hand wave it away and say, no, it's just some sort of God magic, He just knows everything. But like, what is it that He knows? So, and earlier you said, okay, well, He loves us, He wants us to be, so therefore He gives free will, otherwise it's not real love. If you force someone to love you, it's not real love, right? Well, it's like, true, but, I love my dog, and according to Thomas Aquinas, your dog doesn't have free will because it's just sort of simple machinations, it's not the same as us. But, I still love my dog, I still want my dog to do the right thing, I still want him to come when I call him, I still want him to not be mistake. I'm not saying that I'm God and the dog is a human or something like that. I'm not really making that comparison, but at the same time, I'm trying to wrap my head around exactly why we can't agree that there are deterministic ways that things play out, and at the same time believe in a God who loves us and wants the right thing, wants us to do right by him and by each other, and yeah. I guess I'll leave it there. I'm not sure if that was a cogent question.
Well, there are things that happen deterministically in the world. I'm not denying that at all. And some things we can measure in the lab, have some experiments, we can show that certain things are deterministic. We seem to be able to show, at least in very simple systems, that that's the case. And maybe there's a lot more determinism in the world. The philosophical thesis of determinism, though, is that everything is determined. And it's determined to one specific outcome. As for the laws that govern the world, let's set aside law. As I said, laws is kind of an analogy, the word law here. God creates things with natures. And everything God creates, whether it's a human being or a rock or a dog or a tree, has a nature. And the way that the thing behaves flows from its nature. Even when you're talking about, just the speed at which a rock accelerates when I let go of it, right? Its nature is to be attracted to massive objects. That's a nature that God created it with, right? It turns out that you can mathematically model exactly what the rock is going to do, but that's just the particular kind of nature that a rock has. It behaves in a deterministic way. So God did. The word law could be misleading here, because if you use law in a broad sense, as just to mean that things have ways of behaving that are consistent and comprehensible, intelligible, then yeah, everything is subject to those laws, the laws of its own nature. And God knows the natures of the things he created as their creator. So he doesn't know them by observing them, he knows them because he made them. And likewise with all of his creation.
There is something knowable. There is something that you can know.
Yeah.
It's not some magic fairy dust of it's just we have free will. So.
Yeah. No, and this is one of the pillars of an Aristotelian sort of Thomistic view of the universe, and really of a classical view of the universe, which is that things have natures that are knowable. Right? I can study them and know them. And this is something that modern philosophy has, challenged in a lot of ways. In some ways, it's turning back towards the older view that the way to understand the world is by the natures of things. And that's, generally what the Christian intellectual tradition has understood God to have been, is creates things with a particular nature. And the nature of each thing is somehow a reflection of the divine intellect. So, a dog, a fish, a tree, each of these are different ways of imitating the goodness of God in a very, very imperfect way. Right? We're said to be created in the image of God in a special way, but all of creation imitates God in a certain way. So, yeah, all of that is cool. All of that is cool. But determinism is something stronger than that. Determinism is that the outcome of everything is determined to one result. Right? Only one thing could happen and does happen. Only one thing could happen. I'm not sure if that. Maybe we talk afterwards if there's more there. But we should wrap up here because it's been a while. Thank you, guys. Yeah. It's great to have so many people come to talk like this. So yeah, thanks.
Let me give one shameless plug. So on the 26th, we're doing the inverse Inquisition. So people have sent me questions. I'm going to be answering them. If you have questions, send it to me as well.
That's a great name, the inverse Inquisition.
I came up with that.
Happy to bring their lighters.
Bring your lighters, yeah. For every one you chop, anyway. Good. So, all right, get out. Thanks, everybody. Thank you guys, Father Raphael.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.